Okay, take it away. Take us to the Lower East Side. Marty?
Okay, thank you. All right. So we just have to make the transition of my slide presentation. I want to thank for Michelle inviting me back today. So you could put a comment on chat. You can type it in and make sure you hit the enter key when you type it in. If you have a question, you can put it on chat, but I will not answer the question during the lecture. I will answer it after the lecture. If you don't use chat, then we'll have a regular Q&A after the lecture. Okay. Okay, so I was born and raised in the Bronx, and I have some very good memories about the Bronx. But I have great memories about the Lower East Side. My father belonged to a fraternal organization in Pythias, and he had his meeting hall on the Lower East Side. Back then, there were a lot of meeting halls in that particular area. So once a month, we went down to the Lower East Side. We took the subway. My parents did not own a car. When we got to the Lower East Side, my father would go to his meeting hall. And when he was done at the meeting hall, we would go shopping. My parents would buy blankets, pillowcases, sheets, towels, pickles, candy, lamps, you name it. They bought it on the Lower East Side. But the highlight of the day was when we went to one of the many restaurants in the area. Sometimes we go to Ratner's. Ratner's was a dairy restaurant. You come into Ratner's, and on the table, there was this basket of onion rolls. They were the best onion rolls in the world. To this day, I can't find an onion roll like I got at Ratner's. Sometimes we go to Kantus Delicatessen. They're still in business. That's where I would get my pastrami and rye and my dark brown celery soda. And Cat still has the old world look. The tables are the same. The tables that I sat at when I was 10, 12 years old, they're still there. So when I go to Katz, I sit there and I visualize being there with my parents, my grandparents, sometimes my aunts and uncles. It's going back to my roots. Sometimes we go to one of those Romanian steak restaurants in the area, and we come in, and every table had a jar of chicken fat or schmaltz on it. Chicken fat because the Eastern European Jews were not allowed to fry their meat with butter, so they used chicken fat. But they didn't use chicken fat, they used goose fat. When the Eastern European Jews arrived in the Lower East Side in the 1880s, they were using goose fat. It wasn't until the 1920s that they started using chicken fat. And throughout the Lower East Side, there were goose tenement farms. About a month before they would bring the goose into a rabbi for a ritual killing, they would force feed the goose and get more fat and a fatter liver. And you know, a delicacy of the Eastern European Jews was chopped liver. And I remember going to all those Jewish weddings and bar mitzvahs where at the smorgasbord, they would have sculpted chopped liver in the shape of a swan. Can you imagine getting paid to sculpt chopped liver? I mean, I can see sculpting in bronze, marble, limestone, but chopped liver. It reminds me of a Henny Youngman joke I once heard. There were these two ladies both admiring a carved ice sculpture of the bar mitzvah boy, life-size. And one lady said to the other lady, "This is beautiful. Was it Epstein who carved this ice sculpture?" And the other lady said, "No, Epstein only carved in chopped liver." So then I went back to the Bronx with my parents. We lived in a 5-story walkout building. Our apartment was on the first floor. And in the kitchen, on the windowsill, my mother usually kept a jar of chicken fat. And every night, we would have a snack about 9 o'clock at night after dinner. The snack consisted of smearing chicken fat on a piece of rye bread with a raw piece of onion. And this thing with chicken fat was going on with me for years. And here I am. I've proven one thing to the medical community, that some of it is genetic. So before we start our tour of the Lower East Side, I want to give you a brief history of the area first. The Lower East Side at one time was all farmland. It was owned by a family named the Delancey family. And during the American Revolution, the Delanceys were loyalists to the Crown of England. They didn't want to overthrow the monarchy. They were making a lot of money. They had a good thing going. So after the American Revolution, the Delanceys had to get into New York. If they didn't leave, they probably would have been killed. And they went back to England. After the American Revolution, about 90% of the nation was farmland. And it was Alexander Hamilton one of the greatest founding fathers of this nation, if not the greatest, he didn't want the nation to be 90% farmland. He wanted the nation to be a commercial and manufacturing center. But Hamilton wanted immigrant labor to build up the nation, not slave labor. It was slave labor that built up the 17th century Dutch settlement at the tip of Manhattan. It was the British that used slave labor to build up the 13 colonies. So Hamilton wanted immigrant labor, and Hamilton's concept was good for New York because New York has the greatest harbor in the world. So now I'm going to explain to you why the immigrants arrived in the Lower East Side. Back in the 1840s, there was a potato famine in Ireland. A parasite had attacked their only crop, the potato. It was their only crop because the British did not impose a food system for the Irish that they can eat like the British. No. So about 2 million Irish died as a result of the potato famine, one of the greatest disasters in the history of mankind. About 2 million Irish left, and about 2 million Irish died, I should say. And they went on coffin ships. And when they left, there was only the young children who left. The parents stayed behind in Ireland. So they knew they would never see their children again. So they held wakes for them when they left to go to America. And then when the Irish arrived in the Lower East Side, they were the only group of immigrants who could not identify with their native food, the potato. The Germans, the Jews, and the Italians were all able to identify with their native foods, but not the Irish. But the Irish did provide the great labor force in the building up of New York. Back in the 1840s, there was political unrest in Germany, and there was an industrial revolution going on where the skilled German craftsmen could not compete with the machinery. Of all the immigrants that arrived in the Lower East Side, the Germans were the most skilled. They were merchants, bankers, tailors, doctors. In the 1850s, about 1/3 of all your doctors in New York were German. They started a hospital back then in New York. Today, that hospital is called Lenox Hill Hospital. Some of the Germans arrived with Charles Pfizer. Charles Pfizer built his first pharmaceutical plant in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and during World War II, provided large quantities of penicillin to the soldiers. John Washington and Emily Roebling, who designed and built the Brooklyn Bridge, to this day, one of the greatest bridges in the world. And Thomas Nast, a German illustrator, created Santa Claus. Santa Claus, to this day, one of the greatest merchandising achievements of all time. The last float of the Thanksgiving Day parade has Santa Claus in it. Let the shopping begin. And Thomas Nast also created Uncle Sam. And one of the greatest Americans of the 20th century, Lillian Wall. Lillian Wall created the first visiting nurse service in the world. And today it's known as the Henry Street Settlement, which serves the current immigrants of the Lower East Side. Isidore and Nathan Strauss, two brothers who emigrated from Germany, were at one time the co-owners of Macy's department store. And it was Isidore and Ida Strauss who perished on the Titanic. Nathan Strauss had 4 sons. One of his sons was Peter Strauss. Peter Strauss's second wife was Monica Lewinsky's mother. And then we get Bloomingdale's department store and Temple Emmanuel, built by wealthy German Jews on Fifth Avenue, the largest Reformed temple in the world. So most of the Germans that arrived in the Lower East Side were not Jewish. But those Germans who were Jewish, most of them Reformed Jews. Even though they were somewhat unaffiliated in their religion, they still belonged to a German Jewish community in the Lower East Side. They still wanted their children to marry German Jews, and they wanted to be buried in a German Jewish cemetery. So when the Germans arrived in the Lower East Side, what was more important to religion back then, for them, was beer and culture. So along the East River, they built all these breweries. And then along the Bowery, they had these elaborate theaters. They had interconnecting rooms. One room was a dance hall, another room a theater, another room, another dance hall. They had several dance halls in the building. They can accommodate up to 1,000 people. They were put up in the 1840s. They stayed open until the outbreak of World War I, when there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in the city. And then the Bowery took a turn for the worse. You had flop houses in the Bowery. In a flop house, a person would lie down on the floor. Proprietor would take a piece of white chalk and make an outline of their body. They had to sleep in that designated spot at night. And then you have brothels in the Bowery, dime a dance establishment. The girls were called the taxi dancers, the place where you can get the asymmetrical haircut. Now the Bowery and the entire Lower East Side has become gentrified and upscale. The young people that want to go into the Lower East Side, their great-great-grandparents couldn't wait to get out of the area. A one-bedroom apartment in a new building now on the Lower East Side goes for about $4,000 a month. Egg cream, last time I was there, $7. Bagel, cream cheese and lox, $20. So when the German Jews arrived in the city, they couldn't get into most colleges. Most colleges back then had quotas and how many Jews were allowed in, including Harvard. So the city of New York built a college, CCNY in Harlem, a very, very prestigious college. Dr. Jonas Salk attended CCNY. Mayor Koch, Gene Slutsky, the founder of Weight Watchers, Frank Schiffman, who founded the Apollo Theater, and the Schiffman's graduating class was Edward G. Robinson. In the early days, most of the students were German Jewish boys. So back then, CCNY stood for Circumcised Citizens of New York. Back in the 1880s, there was a lot of poverty in southern Italy, so a number of Italians immigrated and arrived in New York and settled on the Lower East Side. Before they arrived, they thought the streets of New York were paved in gold. But when they arrived, the streets were not paved in gold. In fact, they ended up paving the streets. What's interesting about the Italians, they introduced the spaghetti. And that was one of the things, we got the cuisines of all the immigrants that arrived here. But the spaghetti was the one food that the other immigrants and non-Italians did not have, they couldn't figure out how to eat it. With the Germans, a sausage, no problem. With the Jews, a knish. You would just put it in your hand and munch on it. But the spaghetti provided a challenge for the non-Italians. But the Italians, and if you look at this picture, what's interesting, a person the other day asked me, how come they're all men there? And there's one or two ladies in the group. The reason being that the wives stayed behind in Italy. The men arrived in the Lower East Side. And then they sent money back to Italy. So even though they were immigrants here in America, the economy of Italy flourished because they were sending money back there, and many of them wanted to go back to Italy. The Jews weren't going to go back to Russia. The Germans became well established in New York, so they stayed in New York. The Irish were certainly not going to go back to Ireland, so they were the only group of immigrants that were returned and sending money to their native land. But the Italians, the next time you're in Manhattan and you see the great stone carvings in the buildings, they were done by Italian stone carvers. In fact, there were 6 brothers, Italian brothers, the Piccarelli brothers, great stone carvers. They set up their studio in the Bronx and they lived in the Lower East Side. They carved Abraham Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. They carved the 2 lions in front of the New York Public Library on 42nd Street. So the Russian-Polish Jews. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II of Russia was assassinated, and they blamed the Jews. Used the Jews as a scapegoat. So let the Russian pogroms begin. The Cossacks burned down their houses and entire villages. They had to get out of Russia. They knew they were never going to go home back again. They just wanted to live a normal life. When they left Russia, they said, God, I'm coming to America. Their lives became as precarious as that as a fiddler on the roof. Of all the immigrants that arrived in the Lower East Side, the Russian Polish Jews had the biggest impact on the area, and they created a transformation. What do we get from the Eastern European Jews? We get the Yiddish language. The Yiddish language wasn't invented here. It was brought over from Russia. And the Yiddish language has been incorporated into the American vocabulary. Here's a moving company. They took the Yiddish word schlep and they named their company Schleppers. What about chutzpah? Let's say you're in a supermarket and you're on the express lane, and the person in front of you is checking out a lot more items than they're supposed to on the express lane. That takes chutzpah. And what about kosher? Many non-Jews use the word kosher. If a business deal doesn't sound right, they'll say it doesn't sound kosher. When Bernie Madoff was giving those high yields, some people said that doesn't sound kosher. A great example of a non-Jew using the word kosher is the Commodore Vanderbilt. When he died in 1877, he left behind an estate worth $100 million. He left 95% of his estate to his oldest son, William Vanderbilt. He didn't think his other children could preserve his estate. He referred to them in his will as a non-kosher Vanderbilts, and Vanderbilt was of Dutch descent. So when the Russian Jews were in Russia, they had the Yiddish Theater. So when they arrived in the Lower East Side, they brought the Yiddish Theater with them. They were all along 2nd Avenue from Houston to 14th Street. It was known as the Yiddish Rialto. This was a big upgrade for the immigrant. Now they can get out of their tenements. They did their social networking that way. Even if they didn't understand the production, it didn't matter. It was common for mothers to breastfeed their children at the Yiddish Theater. But the greatest, or one of the greatest Yiddish actors who appeared in the Lower East Side was Jacob Adler. Jacob Adler was born in Odessa. He survived 2 pogroms, and then he moved to New York. When he moved to New York, he met his wife in New York, and they had a daughter by the name of Stella Adler. Stella Adler created that great acting school. One of her pupils was Marlon Brando. So Jacob Adler's specialty was the Jewish King Lear. And you know, King Lear endured a lot of human suffering, particularly from his children. Also, in the Yiddish Theater back then, it was common for audience members to scream. There was this fusion of public and private. One day, Jacob Adler was putting on a Jewish King Lear, and a man in the audience couldn't take it anymore. He got up and he started screaming. And he went to Jacob. He said to Jacob, "Get rid of your rotten children. Come home with me. My wife is a good cook. She'll take care of you." Eddie Cantor was born and raised in the Lower East Side, one of the founders of the March of Dimes. His name wasn't Eddie, his name was Isidore. His girlfriend, Ida, who he eventually married, always wanted a boyfriend by the name of Eddie. His mother died when he was very young, and his father abandoned him. He was raised by his grandmother, Esther. He would sing songs in the cafeteria of a school in the Lower East Side. So ladies and gentlemen, Eddie Cantor singing, making whoopee. And you were not permitted to use the word sex. So Eddie Cantor used the word whoopee.
The choir sings, here comes.
And Jimmy Durante grew up in the Lower East Side. His father was a barber. His mother was a mail order bride. Jimmy Durante was born in the back of his father's barbershop. His biggest fan was John Barrymore. John Barrymore was a great Shakespearean actor. He loved Jimmy Durante. One day he went over to Jimmy Durante and said, "Jimmy, how would you like to play Hamlet?" And Jimmy Durante said, "I can't play in a small town like that." So Jimmy Durante sang the song, "Make Someone Happy." To this day, that song is one of the greatest songs about brightening up a person's day. Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are. Mrs. Calabash could have been his wife. She could have been a secret love, or could have been a name on the sign above a railroad station. When he was saying good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are, he was saying good night to humanity. George Burns, him and his 8 brothers and sisters slept on a single mattress in a tenement in the Lower East Side. George Burns shined shoes in the Lower East Side. George Burns made syrup in a candy store in the Lower East Side, and George Burns sold newspapers in the Lower East Side and became one of the greatest entertainers of all time. Married Gracie Allen from the Lower East Side. Gracie Allen was Irish Catholic. It was unheard in those days for an Irish Catholic to marry a Jew, but they had a great marriage. She was a very important part of his act. And when George Burns was 98 years old, he said, "How can I die? I'm booked. I would go out with women my age, but there are no women my age." And Irving Berlin, what a great story about him. When he was 4 years old, his name was Israel Berlin. He was lying on the side of the road in a blanket, watching the Cossacks burn down his house and his entire village. So when the Berlin family, when he was 5 years old, the Berlin family had to get out of Russia. Again, they just wanted to live a normal life. They settled in the Lower East Side. Their residence was 330 Cherry Street on the Lower East Side. One day, Israel Berlin is sitting on the front stoop, and two bullies picked him up and threw him in East River. At that time, there was a lot of garbage in East River. So Israel Berlin had to keep pushing the garbage off to the sides, and that's how he learned how to swim. It was the East River crawl. Israel Berlin had to quit school in the second grade when he was only 8 years old. A lot of these children had to quit school at an early age to support their families. They didn't have the social reform programs back then that they have today. Al Smith grew up in the Lower East Side, never attended high school. He learned about people by studying them at the Fulton Fish Market, became governor of New York. Jenny Grossinger had to quit high school at the third grade. And Jenny Grossinger opened up and built one of the greatest hotels ever in the history of America. These young children who succeeded like that were known as the intellectualized workers. They could pick up scraps of knowledge off the street. They were self-taught, and they spent a lot of time in the library learning English. We can thank Andrew Carnegie for that. Andrew Carnegie donated $5.2 million to build 67 branches of the New York Public Library. So now we're going to start a tour of the Lower East Side, and we come to Schimmel's Knishes. You could probably get a knish in your area where you live now as good as Schimmel's, but Schimmel's is an icon. This is where parents and grandparents take their children and grandchildren, and they tell them, when I was your age, this is when my grandparents or parents would take me for knish. Jonas Schimmel started the business. He was a rabbi in Romania. Initially, he sold knishes off a pushcart and in the streets of New York. And then in 1933, May LaGuardia banned pushcarts in the streets of New York. So Schimmel's went into a store. But this is an icon. Barbra Streisand, big fan of Schimmel's. And when President Clinton was in the White House, he had knishes delivered from Schimmel's to the White House. All his knishes are a round knish. His two most popular knishes are the potato and the kasha. I happen to like his potato knish, and I prefer to have it with sour cream. This is the Angel Orenson Center today. Angel Orenson is a sculptor. But this building was a German Jewish temple, Anshe Kasset. So when the German Jews arrived in the 1840s, they built three temples. This was the first of the three located on Norfolk Street. So the German Jews on the Lower East Side, they arrived in the 1840s. Then the Russian Jews arrived in the 1880s. The German Jews did not get along with the Russian Jews. The German Jews, most of them were well educated and well off financially. That wasn't the case with the Russian Jews. The German Jews were the high hat. The Russian Jews, the skull cap. The German Jews were the bosses. The Russian Jews were the workers. They wanted to unionize. But the German Jews didn't want unions. It would have meant money out of their pockets. The German Jews placed a high value on punctuality. The Russian Jews were on Jewish Standard Time, always late. So at a mixed Jewish wedding, the German Jews would get to the cocktail hour about a half an hour early and expect to be served. The Russian Jews would get to the cocktail hour about a half an hour late and end up eating the leftovers. So when the Russian Jews arrived in the Lower East Side, the German Jews left the area, and actually many of them went to Harlem. Then a Russian Jewish congregation purchased the building and made it an Orthodox synagogue named Oheb Sadek. And here's how it looks today. Built in 1849 by German Jews, it's one of the few interiors in New York where you go inside and you get a feeling you're going back in time. What's interesting is a balcony here. The German Jews did not need a balcony, they had mixed seating. So the purpose of the balcony was for the overflow. And then when the Russian Jews made it an Orthodox synagogue, they had separate seating, so the balcony was already there. So Mr. Orenson now has high-end events here. Because what happened is, by the 1930s and 40s, most of the Jews were out of the area. So this building was vacant for more than 50 years, and Mr. Orenson's purchased the building, and he has high-end events there. Sarah Jessica Parker got married there. Al Pacino has done some filming there. Lady Gaga had a concert there, and Spike Lee has done some filming there. And here's how it looks in preparation for a wedding. This is a 1927 class photo at Seward Park High School in the Lower East Side. This young gentleman here, his name was Joseph Addis, Attas. He came over from Greece and became one of many Greek Jewish Americans from the Lower East Side. 100% Greek, 100% Jewish, 100% proud to be an American. About 2,000 years ago, Joseph's ancestors were forced to leave ancient Israel on a slave ship bound for Rome. A storm forced the boat to land in Greece, where the immigrants developed its own Greek-Jewish dialect. The Jewish community were called the Romanites. Joseph Addis was a congregant at this Romanite synagogue, Kehilia Kedosha Janina, still active today at 280 Broome Street in Lower East Side. This is the last remaining Romanite synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. Allen Street, the elevated train is no longer there. It was torn down in the 1940s. But in the early days, there was a lot of commercial sex in that area, a lot of prostitution. About 25% of women were prostitutes. Now, that might seem like a high number to you, but you have to see where it's coming from. A lot of these young girls worked in sweatshops, working 60 hours a week, making $1 to $2 a week. Many of their fathers abandoned the families. So a lot of these girls were forced into prostitution. They were Irish prostitutes, Jewish prostitutes, Italian prostitutes. They were called the handkerchief girls. If they dropped the white handkerchief on the ground and the man picked it up, he wanted to do business with that girl. So I've been told the Jewish prostitutes were on one side of Allen Street, the Italian prostitutes on the other side. The Italian men went to Jewish prostitutes, and the Jewish men went to the Italian prostitutes. So this tells you two things, that the grass is greener on the other side, or you don't want to meet your sister. Also, along Allen Street, there were a lot of shtibels back then. Shtibels were one-room synagogues. So if a husband and wife were walking along Allen Street on the way to a shtibel, the prostitute would yell out to the husband, "Oh, I'm prettier than your wife." Now, there was a very famous Jewish prostitute. Her name was Tilly Taub, T-A-U-B. She refused to work on the high holy days. She went to the synagogue. Can you imagine a guy comes over there and he says, "Where's Tilly today?" "Oh, she's in the synagogue praying." Push carts, that was the public market back then. There were about 2,000 push carts in the streets of the Lower East Side. For 10 cents a day, a man can rent out a push cart from a push cart stable. Here's where you would get damaged eggs, eyeglasses for 35 cents, old coats for 50 cents. Some people can only afford to buy one wing of the chicken. And some people would buy one egg. They would cut the egg into different sections, and distribute a different section of the egg to each one of their children. This is where the bargaining sessions originated. So let's say a person got a price from a pushcart dealer and they started walking away. They would call him back because they had to sell everything off the pushcart that day. They couldn't take anything back with them. So in 1933, Mayor LaGuardia banned pushcarts in the streets of New York because the World's Fair was coming into New York and he wanted the city to have a more modern look. And the pushcarts certainly did not portray a modern look, so they built the Essex Street Market. And in the Essex Street Market, they had stalls for the pushcarts to go into. This was the first Romanian American congregation. And in 2006, the roof collapsed, took with the rest of the building, and now it's just an empty lot on Rivington Street in the Lower East Side. Like I said before, most of these synagogues, or all of them, were vacant for more than 50 years. So they weren't able to save this one, but I want to tell you about it. They had an open gallery here. You see the open gallery? In Russia, there was a screen here. Of course, the gallery was separating the men from the women. So the open gallery is an American introduction. This was known as the Kantus Carnegie Hall. The acoustics were phenomenal here. The greatest cantor of all time sang here. His name was Yosel Rosenblatt. When he sang here, the synagogue was jam-packed. There could be hundreds of people waiting outside the synagogue, Jew and non-Jew, hoping they can get in and see and hear Cantor Rosenblatt. They say that when he sang in the synagogue, it was like he was having a direct dialogue with God. The other cantor that sang here was Richard Tucker, who also sang at the Metropolitan Opera. George Burns was a congregant here, and Red Buttons and Eddie Cantor were in the choir. And Edward G. Robinson got bar mitzvah here. When he got bar mitzvah, he made the longest speech than any other bar mitzvah boy in the history of the synagogue. His name wasn't Edward, his name was Emmanuel. He changed his name to Edward because that was the name of the King of England back then. He said, if it's good enough for a king, it's good enough for me. So here's Edward G. Robinson when he got bar mitzvah. The speech lasted well over an hour. During the speech, or after the speech, the audience could not give him a standing ovation and applaud because of an Orthodox synagogue. So at the reception, an elderly parishioner said to his father, "Perhaps with that voice, he'll be the savior of our people." Edward G. Robinson was born 1893 in Budapest, Romania. Back then, Jewish children, were deprived the right to be educated in the public schools and universities. When he arrived in New York in 1904 at Ellis Island, he said, "I was born again. Life for me began when I was 10 years old." Here are boys and girls pushing the walls of their tenements to the street. Again, they got street education on the streets, and they picked up scraps of knowledge self-taught. And of course, you got to mention Cash's Delicatessen, a New York icon. The two most popular tourist attractions now in New York are walking over the Brooklyn Bridge and getting a pastrami sandwich at Cash's Delicatessen. Here's a pastrami sandwich. Someone did a survey about sandwiches in America, and he concluded this is the #1 sandwich in America. Last I heard, it was going for $23. You get a very small pickle with it. It's a big tourist attraction, like I said before. The owner of Katz told me that a lot of tourists don't know it's a Jewish deli, so many of them, or some of them, want their pastrami on white bread. He can't give it to them on white bread. The pastrami was soaked right through, so he tells them we don't even stock white bread here. Now, Katz has never been kosher, and that's very interesting, because when the Jews left Russia, they were the Orthodox Jews. They were all kosher. But when they left, they said, "God, I'm coming to America." As soon as they got on a ship, they gave up some of their Jewishness. And they knew that in order to survive in America, many of them knew they're going to have to assimilate into the American society, dress like Americans, look like Americans, read the sport pages. Many of them wanted their children to go to the public schools so that they too can assimilate into the American society. So many of them kept a kosher home in their tenements. But when they ate out, it was okay if it wasn't kosher. And you know, the Lower East Side has always been their Chinatown. And Jews love Chinese food. What they liked about a Chinese restaurant, there were no religious symbols in the store. Maybe a small Buddha by the cash register. And what they liked about the Chinese restaurants, they would cut the shrimp into very, very tiny pieces so they didn't realize they were eating shrimp. And they would say, what I can't see won't hurt me. And to this day, every year on Christmas Day, there are many Jews that celebrate Christmas Day by going to a Chinese restaurant and a movie theater. My parents kept a kosher home. My father immigrated from Poland. My mother got all the kosher meat from a kosher butcher in the Bronx. But when they ate out, it was okay if it wasn't kosher. I'll never forget the time my parents moved to a new apartment at Co-op City in the Bronx. About a week after they moved in, I get a call from my father. He said, Marty, you gotta come visit us. There's a great Chinese restaurant in the area. So about 100 years ago, Ben Katz, the original owner, he's standing right around here. The sign maker's putting up the sign, Katz's Delicatessen. He's up on a ladder and he yells down the bed, hey, Ben, do you want anything else on the sign? And Ben said, that's all. So we get a separate sign of that's all. So 3 presidents have eaten the Katz: Carter, Reagan, and Clinton. They say that if you want to get the Jewish vote, you better go to a Jewish deli. Mayor Koch called that eating for power. But that backfired on a politician once. Back in 1972, Senator McGovern was making a presidential bid, and he purchased a kosher hot dog from a street vendor. With the kosher hot dog, he had a glass of milk. The Jewish community went into an uproar. Just think, if McGovern had gotten a can of Doc Brown soda, he might have been elected president. And during World War II, they had that sign, send a salami to your boy in the army. And one of my favorite films was filmed here, Where Harry Met Sally. That's where you had Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal, and Meg Ryan had that sexual experience, and the director's mother said, I'll have whatever she had. Well, the owner of Katz told me that to this day, ladies come in with their boyfriends and their husbands, and they want to get a bite of that pastrami so that they too can share in that sexual experience. But the owner of Katz told me the pastrami had nothing to do with it. Tenant. By 1895, there were 40,000 tenements in the Lower East Side, housing about 1.3 million people. Each floor had 4 apartments. There was a bedroom in each apartment, a kitchen, and a living room, no bathrooms, no running water, virtually no ventilation. Tuberculosis was rampant. The largest room was about the size of a taxi. The parents would sleep in a bedroom. Sometimes they would rent out their bed to a newly arrived immigrant for some additional income. There were also beds in the kitchen and living room. They would unscrew a door and put the door in 2 chairs to make a bed. There were sweatshops in the tenements. People were doing what's called piecework. They were earning about $1 to $2 a week, working 60 hours a week. There was a spigot in the back of the tenement water. The mothers would fill up buckets of water and walk up the steps of the tenements. They were like human freight elevators. And some of the landlords would rent out an apartment to a prostitute. So these young children were exposed to vice. They would tell their children, oh, don't go near that apartment, but they probably knew what was going on. They would use the fire escapes in the summer. And 90% of the immigrants would not go to a hospital. They would die in their apartment. One of their 3 rooms was called the sick room, and that's where they died. But despite all that, it was home to them. They put wallpaper on the walls. They laid linoleum on the floors. They put up pictures of famous people of the time on their walls. The most famous picture they put up was President Roosevelt. They loved him. President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt got most of their ideas about the activists in the Lower East Side. That's where they got most of their ideas for social reform. The Italians called him Saint Roosevelt. Here's one of the greatest museums in New York, the Tenant Museum, located at 97 Orchard Street. This museum housed about 7,000 immigrants from 1863 until 1935 when it closed. It was vacant for about 70 years. And then a lady by the name of Ruth Abrams, who was a social worker, in 1988, with a group of investors, purchased the building and created the Tenant Museum. This museum is about German immigrants, Jewish, Italian, and Irish immigrants. So it's a museum about ordinary people. But what's interesting about this, and it's very important, the Lower East Side is not a protected area. The buildings are not landmarked. The buildings along Fifth Avenue are all landmarked. We have a landmark commission in New York, so the buildings on Fifth Avenue cannot be torn down. The buildings on Central Park West are all landmarked. The Landmark Commission does not consider the tenements of landmark, they don't consider it to be a landmark importance, so they're not landmarked. So every year, more and more tenements are being torn down and high-priced condominiums are going up. But the Tenant Museum is a national landmark, so it can never be torn down. This is very important. This was the turning point in the Lower East Side. The Williamsburg Bridge opened in 1903, connecting the Lower East Side to Brooklyn. This was the start of the migration of immigrants leaving the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side provided a way station for thousands of immigrants. They couldn't wait to get out of the area. Now they were moving to another neighborhood with better housing, more air, more light, upward mobility. But they still walked across the Williamsburg Bridge to do their shopping in the Lower East Side, and they would visit the synagogues that they belonged to in the Lower East Side. And then in 1905, the subway opened in the Bronx. So in 1909, the Grand Concourse, the Park Avenue of the Bronx, opened in the Bronx. Now, many people were leaving those deplorable conditions of the Lower East Side and going to the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. They could tell the whole world, I'm here, I've achieved the American dream. We're talking about upward mobility. I'm living on the Grand Concourse with a sunk-in living room. This building was a Baptist church at one time. Before the immigrants arrived in the Lower East Side, there were still Baptists living in the area. As soon as the immigrants arrived, the Baptists left. And then a Russian Jewish congregation purchased the Baptist church, and they named it Beth Hagadol, an Orthodox synagogue. The rabbi here was Jacob Joseph. He was the chief rabbi of the Lower East Side. When he died, there were about 25 mourners outside the synagogue carrying his casket from one synagogue to the other. It closed, it was vacant for many years, and about 7 or 8 years ago, 2 young boys burnt it down completely to the ground. It wasn't a bias attack, they just wanted to burn down the building. They could never rebuild it. The sad part of the story is there are many Asians now residing in the Lower East Side. They were going to convert this building into an Asian, Jewish, cultural center. What a great idea, but I don't know if they're still going to go ahead with that plan. In another location, of course. This is Mr. Fibush. He owns a zipper store on Allen Street in the Lower East Side. He opened up his store December 7th, 1941, and of course you all know the significance of that date. He made a zipper for Margaret Truman's wedding gown, and he got a call to make a zipper for Bernie Madoff. He doesn't know why he got the call, but he got the call. Doesn't use a computer. His hard drive is in his head. So if you went into his shop and there was a certain zipper you wanted, within about 2 or 3 minutes, he'll have that zipper for you. Bernstein on Essex. Schmoker Bernstein's no longer standing. First kosher Chinese restaurant in New York City. Substituted veal, beef, and chicken livers for pork. The waiters wore Chinese caps instead of yarmulkes. The popular dish was lo mein Bernstein's made with chicken livers. Seward Park High School, named after William Seward. William Seward was governor of New York, Secretary of State under Lincoln, and in 1867 purchased Alaska from Russia. In 1867, he paid for all Alaska $7 million. You can't even get a high-priced condominium in the city now for $7 million. That was a great acquisition, because from that great acquisition, we get baked Alaska. Some of the people that attended Seward Park High School, Tony Curtis, Walter Matthau, Zero Mistel. His name wasn't Zero, his name was Sam. He didn't do well at auditions. One day he auditioned at Cafe Society, and the owner said, Sam, you're a nice guy. I want to give you a break, but you're starting from the bottom. I'm going to call you Zero. That's how he got the name Zero. And a great Irish writer taught here, Frank McCourt. He wrote that wonderful novel, Angela's Ashes. So when immigrant children arrived at Seward Park High School, they were looking out of these windows. They were looking north. And what do you think they saw when they were looking north? They saw the American dream. That's what they saw. And many of them, through their struggle and education, were able to achieve the American dream. Seward Park High School closed in 2006 because the children of the current immigrants were not achieving academically, and it was a high truancy rate. So presently you have about 5 or 6 specialized schools in the building, but it's no longer Seward Park High School. Rabbi Eisenbach is a Torah scribe, very few to the left. His shop is on Grand Street in the Lower East Side. Rabbi Eisenbach only restores letters in a Torah scroll. He will not do a complete scroll. That's done in Israel. So let's say a letter in a Torah scroll is faded out. They won't ask an adult member if they can decipher the letter. They probably have it memorized. So they ask a young child. If the young child can't decipher the letter, then they bring the Torah scroll to Rabbi Eisenbach. He has to insert in a mikveh before he goes to a shop. A mikveh is a ritual bath. And then he takes the quill from a kosher turkey. The quill comes from the right wing of the turkey, which is stronger than the left wing. He dips the quill in ink, restores the letter, and then the quill gets a ritual burial. Yiddish Synagogue, the first synagogue in the Lower East Side built by Russian Jews, because most of the Russian Jews were poor. So when they arrived in the Lower East Side, they were buying Baptist churches and converting them into Orthodox synagogues. So this synagogue opened in 1890. When it opened in 1890, it was in the middle of shtibels, one-room synagogues, in the middle of Judaic bookshops, in the middle of mikvahs, ritual baths. Today, it's in the middle of Chinatown. So this synagogue was vacant for many years, and we can thank 2 Russian Jews for the financing and the construction of the Yiddish Synagogue. One was Sender Jarmalaski, a wealthy Russian banker, and Isidore and Sarah Gellis, who started the kosher sausage business that was eventually bought over by Hebrew National. So while they were building the synagogue, the congregants were praying at a Baptist church on Allen Street. So now you have the wealthy Russian Jewish banker praying alongside the poor sweatshop workers. So they received $20 million to renovate it on the condition that it would not reopen solely as a synagogue, because there were virtually no Jews in the area anymore. So it opened up as a cultural center, visiting center, museum. There's a nominal fee, and they do have services there on the high holy days. And here's how it looks. after the renovation. Again, the open gallery that we discussed before. And there are two elements that the immigrant had in the synagogue that they didn't have in their tenement: air and light and space. This was the Daily Forward building. There were a number of Yiddish newspapers in the Lower East Side and along East Broadway. And the Daily Forward had the largest circulation of all the Yiddish newspapers. The Jews did not have a Yiddish newspaper in Russia, but they introduced it when they arrived in the Lower East Side. The Daily Forward is no longer in this building. It's now a high-priced condominium. Today, the Daily Forward only has a digital version. And what's interesting about the Daily Forward, they had, if a person had a problem they wanted to discuss, they would write to the editor of the Daily Forward. And those letters were called Bintu briefs. So I want to read to you one letter that was written in 1908 to the editor of the Daily Forward. Dear editor, I recently met a fine girl. She has a flaw, however, that keeps me from marrying her, a dimple in her chin. It is said that people who have this lose their first husband or wife. I'm afraid to marry her. I cannot rest until I hear your opinion. Here's the answer from the Daily Forward editor, 1908. The tragedy is not that the girl has a dimple in her chin, but that some people have a screw loose in their heads. It's tragic humor to find such superstition in the world today. Back then, many husbands would abandon their families. Today, if a husband wants to leave his wife, he sends her an email. He says, dear, I can't take it anymore. You can have the kids. But back then, they didn't have emails. So the Daily Forward had a gallery of missing husbands. And I want to read to you one announcement. Sarah Solomon is searching for a husband who is now uptown. Left me 2.5 years ago. I offer $25 to anyone who will notify me of his whereabouts. He doesn't have to be afraid of divorcing me. Notify me at 132 Ludlow Street in the restaurant. So if you look on the top of the Daily Forward, there's a clock. I have a close-up of it. You see, in the early days, the immigrants, they didn't know what time it was. They were only pocket watches then. The only people that can afford pocket watches were very wealthy people. Wristwatches didn't come out until the outbreak of World War I. So the only way these immigrants could tell what time it was, they had to go outside to a public building to see what time it was. And by the way, the Daily Forward provided the only link between the tenement and the outside world. The cost of the Daily Forward was 1 penny. If they couldn't afford the 1 penny to purchase the Daily Forward, they would go to the local library. The Education Alliance, located on East Broadway today, currently standing, serving the immigrants that are there today. The Education Alliance was all about Americanization and assimilation for the Eastern European immigrants. This is where they would learn English, American history, cooking. Arthur Murray learned how to dance here. Eddie Cantor made his first stage appearance here. The social historian Irving Howe described the Education Alliance as a mixture of night school, settlement house, daycare center, gymnasium, and public forum. Zero Misteau took art courses at the Education Alliance. Here's a quote from Zero Misteau. The Alliance gave me a new life. I had never seen such big rooms before. We can thank Isidore Strauss for the educational life. He was a well-to-do German Jew living uptown, and he was very concerned about the conditions of the Eastern European Jews. He believed that assimilation was good for the image of Judaism. I want to tell you about one interesting boy that spent a lot of time here getting Americanized, who had to quit school at a young age to support his family. His name was David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff emigrated from Russia with his parents, settled on the Lower East Side. David's father contracted tuberculosis, when David was only 15 years old. So David had to support his family. He started his own newspaper route. And then David became a wireless operator at the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company when he's 21 years old. David received a signal on the night of April 14th, 1912, that the Titanic hit an iceberg and it was sinking. David radioed other ships in the area. President Taft ordered all radio stations in the United States to shut off so there would be no signal interference for David Sarnoff. Among those looking over his shoulder were the sons of Ida and Isidore Strauss, who both perished on the Titanic. What a great story. And David eventually became president of Radio Corporation of America. One of the greatest stories in America. Orchard Corset and Bras, doing business located at Stanton and Orchard. The owner of Orchard Corset and Bras is Ralph. He's an Orthodox Jew. So he's not allowed to touch a lady when she comes in for corset and bra. He has to use the eyeball approach. So about a year ago, I took 6 ladies out on a walking tour of the Lower East Side, and he asked me to take them into Orchard and Corset and Bra. I took them in, and one lady wanted to buy a bra. So Ralph stood about 4 feet from her, and he got a size. She went in the back to try it on. He doesn't have a dressing room. You just pull a curtain, a shower curtain along a rod. She tries it on and comes out. Her friend said to Ralph, I want the same bra. Ralph looked at the lady and said, no, that bra won't work for you. It's not for you. Ralph claims that 95% of women are wearing the wrong size bra. He said if the skin pinches in the back, you have the wrong size bra on. And if you look in the store, throughout the store, there are boxes from the floor to the ceiling throughout the store. One day I was in there and Ralph said to me, Marty, people don't come into my store for the atmosphere. They come in for the uplift. And Economy Candy on Remington Street, the only candy store still remaining. Back then, there were about 100 candy stores in the Lower East Side. When I went down there, I loved putting my hands in the barrels of candy and munching on it. We loved it. They were all on Essex Street back then. Big upright for the immigrant. Now they can go in and hold the candy, which is a portable food, as they were walking across along the streets of the Lower East Side. We call this the Wally Wonka of the Lower East Side. It's currently in its 3rd generation of ownership. The first generation, the great-great-grandfather, sold shoelaces in the store. And then after World War II, candy became very affordable. So we started stocking candy, and the candy sold a lot better than the shoelaces. Economy Candy catered one of my birthday parties a number of years ago. Here's where you can get button candy, Mary Jane's, gummies, gumballs. Davis Jr. converted to Judaism in 1950. And then one day he was down in the South and he got up on a bus and the driver said to him, you have to sit in the back of the bus. So Sammy Davis Jr. said, but I'm Jewish. So the bus driver said, well, then you have to get off the bus. So that completes my lecture. Here's my contact information. I'd love to get an email from you with some comments about the lecture. And it's martynewyork1@gmail.com. And below it is my Facebook link. So now we're going to go into a Q&A. All right, we just got to make the transition now. Okay, all right, okay. All right. So, okay. So,
ask him for his email address again.
Okay.
You're right.
Marty, would you kindly give us your email address again? Just put that up again, please.
You know what? I'll write it on chat. How's that? I'll type it in chat. Okay, let me type it in. Yeah, I'm going to type it on chat. Okay, let me do it right now.
Okay.
Okay, I typed it on chat. It should be on chat now. Do you see it?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay. Now, the other thing, if any of you belong to any other groups or organizations, libraries or whatever, I offer 14 different lectures. So if you email me, I will send you my brochure with all the lectures that I currently offer. Okay. Now there is one question here. Did you ever hear of Tippy Katz? How was she related to Ben? I have a photo of my father as an infant with her. I don't know. I don't know if she was related to Ben. I really don't know. The current owner is Jake. He's about fourth or fifth generation. He got bar mitzvah at Kansas, Jake. But I don't know about Tippy. I don't know. Katz is a very common name too. So let's see if there's. Where is Grand Street? Grand Street is in the Lower East Side. Are you referring to Grand, G-R-A-N-D? I think you're referring to Grand Street, G-R-A-N-D. Yeah. What's interesting about Grand Street, it's a very wide street. And the purpose of Grand Street was to be able to get commercial traffic to going from river to river, from the Hudson River to the East River. And that's why they call it the Grand Street, because it's grand and wide. So let me see here. Oh, here. Tippy, no, not here. Well, the origin, what is the origin of Yiddish? That goes back to Europe, probably 17th century, 18th century, yeah. The origin of Yiddish, yeah.
Would you say
it's a German? It's a takeoff of German also, exactly. Yiddish.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. A mixture of German.
Yeah, sure.
And
yeah.
Yes.
Now here's another one. At what age did males start to wear long trousers? I don't know. I know when I was a kid growing up in the Bronx, I wore knickers for a while. I don't know what age men started wearing long trousers. And then opera addict. From Jeff, it said, oh, Jeff is the opera addict. Okay. Is Yonah Shimmel's Kanishri still? Yeah, yes, they are. They're still there. Big tourist attraction. In fact, I have relatives that live in Pennsylvania, and when I visit them, they won't let me come into their homes unless I bring Kanishas from Shimmel's. Yeah. All right. And that's it on the chat. Let me see if there's anything else on chat. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. That's it. I refer more about the buildings and neighborhoods, though. Well, Eddie Cantor, Jimmy Narani, it's just that most people really didn't make it. It's just that some of the people that made it are just incredible stories, living in those conditions and having limited education to make it. It's just one of the greatest stories in America. These people were immigrants at one time. And every immigrant in America should know that story. So the person wanted me to talk more about buildings in the neighborhood. Buildings are important, but what's more important is the immigrant story, the story of the immigrants who were intellectualized workers, picked up scraps of knowledge off the street. Many of them had to quit high school. Eddie Cantor, Jimmy Narani, and Gracie Allen didn't even complete high school. Irving Berlin had to quit school in the second grade. So that's why I put more emphasis on the immigrants and the buildings that were built there, the tenements. I mentioned about a tenement. The buildings are not worthy of landmark status. They didn't even use architects to build those buildings. A carpenter probably built those buildings. They weren't built well. Many of them burnt down and deteriorated, and they don't have, there's no great architectural significance in those buildings in the Lower East Side. Even the new buildings they're putting up today, the new buildings are ugly. They're glass and steel tower. They don't have any great architectural characteristics to them. Those architects, let's say less is more. They're ugly, the new buildings they're putting up there today, the condominiums. They're just functional. It's called modern invest. That's what they're called. So that's why I didn't talk about the buildings, But the story of the immigrants is so important. One of the greatest stories. Every immigrant in America showed a story about the immigrants in the Lower East Side. Even those who didn't make it, and many of them didn't make it, they should still know the story of those who didn't make it and what they had to endure and what they had to go through. And when the Jews arrived in the Lower East Side, there were all signs all over the Lower East Side, no Jews, no dogs. When the Irish arrived in the Lower East Side, the blacks didn't want them. They thought they were going to take their jobs away. No one wanted the Italians when they came in. So what these immigrants were able to achieve, even the ones who didn't make it. And then we were talking about upward mobility, how some of them were able to afford going to the Grand Concourse in the Bronx and then in Brooklyn. That's upward mobility. There are so many immigrants today in America, I don't want to get political or anything, who cannot achieve that upward mobility. A number of them do, but a number of them can't achieve the upward mobility. And that's very important. All right, so anyone else?
When my dad was, just before I was born, he had a little clothing store in Verona, New Jersey, which is very close to Montclair, or butts Montclair. He used to go to the Lower East Side on Sundays and buy merchandise because he couldn't afford to stock a lot of merchandise. He would buy the clothing, they would wrap it in a brown paper wrap, they would put it on a bus. Bus driver would drop it off at the store and put it in front of the store. Nobody ever took it. And he would have, when he got back to Verona, he'd have about 6 or 7 bundles of clothes that he could put on the shelves or racks and sell for the next week or two, and then go back into the Lower East Side again.
Right.
He went to the jobbers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, anyone else?
Marty, have you ever been to the Tenement Museum? Have you ever done the tour there?
Oh yeah, I have. I've been there. Sure, yeah,
Really?
I have. I've been
It's
there.
really
Great
quite an experience.
Yeah. I mean,
And
now
then-
with the pandemic, I don't suggest going now. But
But just to see how people lived, and I mean, it's my dad talked about it, but it's just to really be in it and to see it and to feel it, and size and scope and the way we live now. It's just it's so interesting. And also the Eldred Street Synagogue. I know they used to do tours of that. I don't know if they still do that.
Well, there's still. I don't think they're having tours now during the pandemic. But I take it a tour there. It's a wonderful tour.
Yeah.
The docents are very, very knowledgeable, and so when this pandemic passes over, I would suggest you go to the Tenant Museum and the Eldred Street Synagogue. The Tenant Museum, what makes it so great, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is one of the greatest museums in the world, but it's about a lot of wealthy people donated works of art, which is wonderful, nothing wrong with that. But the Tenant Museum is about ordinary people. And the genealogists have done a lot of research in finding out about people that used to live there. So it's, again, about ordinary people. It's very unique, and very, but one of the few museums in the world like that.
Yeah. Did you answer the question about the Knish place? Is it still open? Did you answer that one?
Which one is that?
Knish. Can we still get a Knish there?
Yeah, they're open. They're open. Yeah. I mean, I haven't been to the Lower East Side since the pandemic broke out in March, but Katz, Katz is curbside pickup. There are lines outside ready to pick up their pastrami sandwich, but you can't eat in Katz right now.
There's for those people that are craving pastrami on rye. I know that there's a new place called Mitzi and Al's. And Al's. It's where the old Park on Plum, Park Street, almost to the corner. It's that old diner space, almost to Bloomfield Avenue, across the street from the Villa Victoria Pizzeria, I think. It's set back a little bit next to the Park Street Auto. The woman who used to run Plum on Park has opened up this. It's called Mitzi and Al's Noshery, I believe. And they specialize in, I'm sure they have chopped chicken livers, not goose livers, but chopped chicken livers and pastrami. So if you have a craving, you could probably do curbside pickup. It's a little closer than the Lower East Side.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
And maybe a little less expensive too.
Well, yeah. Well, pastrami sandwich is expensive. There's the 2nd Avenue Deli. Their pastrami is kosher. It's a kosher restaurant, and they're getting about $23, $25 a sandwich.
Wow. Unbelievable. All right, folks. Well, thank you very much. Or where are we going next week, Marty? Where's our last stop on the tour?
I'm going to look at my book now.
We're going to the Bronx, I think, right?
Yeah, it's the Bronx. Yeah,
You're
yeah.
back in the woods.
That's my hometown, the Bronx. I grew up there.
Okay. Looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Does everyone
Thank
stay
you.
safe?
It was great.
Thanks.
All right, stay safe, all right? Okay.
All right.
Bye
See you
now.
next week, Marty. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
You're welcome.
Bye.